He was born into slavery there, was there when the land was seized, was freed there, worked there the rest of his life, and he's still there today. Now, you probably assume everyone buried in Arlington National Cemetery wore a uniform of some kind. And while that assumption makes perfect sense, it's 100% wrong. Because one of the people buried in Arlington was never a soldier or related to a soldier. He never fought in a war, carried a gun, or even held a rank. He was a formerly enslaved man named James Parks, and his grave might be one of the most quietly powerful in the entire cemetery. James Parks was born into slavery in the early 1800s, literally on the Arlington estate, long before it became a national cemetery. At the time, the land was owned by George Washington Parke Custis, the step-grandson of George Washington. Parks spent his early life enslaved on that plantation that sat directly across the river from the U.S. Capitol. Then the plantation would later belong to Robert E. Lee, and he would stay there. When the Civil War began in 1861, the Union Army seized the Arlington estate, not for symbolism, but for strategy, because it sat high on ground overlooking Washington, D.C. Lee never returned to the estate. The land was taken, and eventually the Union began burying their dead there on purpose. They wanted to make sure Lee could never, ever reclaim it. But James Parks stayed. After emancipation, Parks didn't leave the land where he had been enslaved, not because it held sentimental value or anything like that, but because freedom didn't come with a lot of options. Jobs were scarce, housing was scarce, stability was very rare, so Parks stayed and went to work. For decades, James Parks worked as a laborer and a caretaker at Arlington. He helped dig graves, he maintained the grounds, he watched row after row of Union soldiers buried on land where he had once been property. Now think about that for a moment. A man once enslaved by the family of a Confederate general spent his free life caring for the graves of soldiers who fought to destroy the system that had enslaved him. That's not poetic framing. That's the historical reality. By the time Parks grew old, Arlington had become sacred ground, a national shrine, a place of ceremony and silence, and Parks had become a part of its living memory. He would tell visitors what the land used to be like, where the house stood, what life had been like before the war, a first-hand look at the stories of the history of the site. When James Parks died in 1929, the Army made a very rare decision. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery. No uniform, no military service, no rank whatsoever. He is one of the very few citizens buried there, and one of the only former enslaved people to receive that honor. His grave doesn't dominate the landscape, it doesn't come with a grand monument, but it tells a quiet yet extremely powerful story that Arlington itself cannot escape, nor should it. This land began as a plantation built in the back of slavery, and it became sacred ground. And one of the people who witnessed that entire transformation from beginning to end, from bondage to national shrine, is buried beneath it with honor. James Parks never chose to be part of history. History chose him anyway. And most people just walk past his grave without ever knowing his story, his personal sacrifice, or his name. Let's change that. Like, follow, share, and subscribe for more history hiding in plain sight.